Rabbi Kushner was a Jewish rabbi who cared for his congregation. And his people had all of the same kind of issues that people have. They struggle with the same natural disasters. They struggle with sickness, divorce, death, problems with children. And as he observed all of this in his own congregation in 1981, it led him to write a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Random House, that published the book, said of this book, when Harold Kushner's 3-year-old son was diagnosed with a degenerative disease so that he would live only until his early teens, he was faced with one of life's most difficult questions. Why God? Years later, Rabbi Kushner wrote this straightforward, elegant contemplation of the doubts and fears that arise from when tragedy strikes. Kushner shares his wisdom as a rabbi, a parent, a reader, and a human being. Often imitated but never superseded, When Bad Things Happen to Good People is a classic that offers clear thinking and consolation in times of sorrow. Now, if you're watching via small group or video, I want you to turn the tape off at this point, and I want you to evaluate this title. Do you agree with this title? Why or why not? And when you're ready, go ahead and turn the tape back on again. Random House said that this book is a classic that offers clear thinking and consolation in times of sorrow. But what is this clear thinking? Rabbi Kushner's thesis is that God is doing all he can to help his people. But he can only do so much. I mean, try to understand that God could solve your problem if he was only able to do it. That's his clear thinking. Well, let's not get duped into thinking that God is so limited in his ability that he really is not able to help you and me. That's where I think he has a good heart, but his theology is not quite up to what we find actually in the Old Testament. But what he does do is he does realistically address this question of difficulties that we experience in life, especially when we have done seemingly nothing to cause them. And this makes me think of the book of Job. Now, what is the theme of Job? This is one of those books that is in the Bible that is known quite well, actually, to many who don't really read the Bible much. Many would say that the theme of Job is, why do the innocent suffer? Righteous suffering. Why does that actually happen? Well, it certainly is one of the key questions of our day, but interestingly, this is not answered in Job. He never really gives a definitive answer to that particular question. More defined, as Roy Zook says in his book, Biblical Theology of the Old Testament, he says maybe the issue is better said, why does man worship God? Because after all, that's what Satan says at the beginning of the book of Job. Or even more clearly, how will man react to God when God seems unconcerned about his problems? This is a little bit more defined. And yet, I wonder whether the Lord actually answers this question. Well, this is an applicational question for us. How will we respond? But the book is more than just about how will we respond. I think it's more about how should we respond. And so I'm going to seek to summarize the book, at least in the question that it answers, with this particular question. What's the proper response to righteous suffering? This is a relevant issue that everybody faces in every culture, in every society, because we all deal essentially with the same kinds of things. Sickness, death, difficulties in our lives, whether they be financial or our marriages or children, with our businesses. And we don't feel like we really have done anything to deserve it. And so therefore, it is what we might call righteous suffering. Here's the question I think that Job actually answers. Now, the rule of Job's day, the teaching of the wise men in his time, which was about 2000 BC, was that sin leads to suffering. If a person is suffering, then it must be because they've sinned. Job has a lot of dialogue about that particular issue, pondering that and questioning whether that really is the case. The people of Job's day said, in conjunction with that godliness leads to blessing. So if you have a life that's blessed, if you have a life that's wealthy and seemingly without health and other kinds of issues, then it's because you're living a godly life. But here's the problem. What about a person who is suffering and maybe has not sinned? How do you handle that? And Job is a fantastic book to help us explore that question. It starts off very clearly in the first 2 chapters with the setting. The setting is that Job really hasn't done anything wrong. In fact, suffering sometimes comes when we haven't done anything wrong. So the reader coming into Job does not have to question whether Job was sinful or not. We are basically given the author's opinion, or the author's of divine opinion, that Job was actually a righteous man. So as a reader, we don't have to wonder about that. So we have what might be called the reader's omniscience, or the reader being able to know something that the people in the story don't actually know. That Job is a righteous man. That's basically where we come as we get into Job chapter 1. The description of Job is quite amazing, because we don't find these kinds of descriptions in the Bible very often. Normally what the Bible does is it shows what people are doing, and the reader makes a decision himself or herself as to what kind of person this is. It's not actually a descriptive account, but this is very different. The first few verses of Job say this: "In the land of Uz there was a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. And he had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, 'Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts.'" And this was Job's regular custom. We can learn a lot from these first few verses. Number one, he was offering the sacrifices, so we're obviously talking about a period before the law of Moses. We're also talking about a time when wealth is depicted in terms of numbers of animals rather than gold and silver, which was the way of determining wealth around the time of David and Solomon, 1000 BC. So many believe that this is actually 2000 BC or so, around the time of Abraham. There's also a description of Satan that follows. One day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied, "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Very well then. Everything he has is in your hands. But on the man himself do not lay a finger." And then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. What we find as we go through this chapter, and even into chapter 2, is we find that Satan is absolutely ruthless with Job when God gives him opportunity to inflict pain on Job. This tells us a bit about Satan, does it not? In chapter 1, there are 4 attacks. Sabaeans, the fire of God, the Chaldeans, and the wind, that basically take everything Job owned in terms of his possessions. And even in the last one, in verses 18 and 19, it says, "While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, 'Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. And I am the only one who escaped to tell you.'" Wow. And at this, Job got up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. And then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." And in all of this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Satan waited until a day of celebration to actually take all 10 of his children. Notice that Satan also didn't challenge God's limitations. Satan has to work within the limitations of God. And what we find is that really the focal point here is actually it goes back and forth from man to God to man to God. And yet this is ruthless. I don't think Satan is going to be any nicer to us than he ever has to be. He is truly out to destroy anything related to the work of God. That's the beginning narrative, at least part of it. There's chapter 2 as well. And the book actually, one of the key characteristics of the book is it switches back and forth from narrative to poetry and then back to narrative. And there are parallels in this book. It has an opening narrative and then Job's lament, soliloquy in chapter 3. The friends dispute with him, and then Job has a closing soliloquy that's kind of B prime, you might say. And then Elihu has a disputation with Job, and finally God has a disputation with Job. And the book closes with a narrative as well. So it begins with narrative, it has poetic literature in the middle, and then it ends with narrative. And it's a masterpiece of literature. Most of Job records men dialoguing in poetic form as well. This may seem strange to Western ears, but to those in the East, it's not quite so strange, because even this kind of poetic discourse is not so uncommon today in the East. And the major question addressed in this book, why do the righteous suffer, is never actually specifically answered, except for the fact that God is God, and God has the right to do whatever He wants. So, to this question, did God answer Job? One thing really to think about. Did He really answer him? We see that the Lord will actually speak for several chapters at the end. But what kind of answer did He actually give him? And what can we learn from that? How did he actually do it? Well, the way that this book outlines quite naturally is the way that I am outlining it as well today. And it basically has the narrative as the book ends, the beginning and the end, about righteous suffering starting off. And then I call the middle section unsuccessful dialogue, because as much as the men talk about why Job actually sinned and what to do to help him, they really don't come up with any real answers. And then the book ends with the restoration of Job, which is quite an encouraging and positive end. The way that I sum up the whole book is this phrase: God's incomprehensibility explains righteous suffering. Think about that. God does not have the obligation to any of us to be comprehensible. God does not have to answer your questions and mine. That's essentially what we find in this book. Now, where was Uz? Uz is said by some to be in a northern location up toward the Euphrates River, whereas others think Uz is farther in the south. I tend to think that probably the southern location is correct, but it doesn't really change the meaning of the book too much. What is more important is not so much where Uz was, but rather what's actually happening in this opening narrative. We're actually seeing what may appear to be a game of chess. One artist has depicted it this way. Up on the top of the chessboard, it just looks like everything is quite nice and everything's being moved on the chessboard, but underneath it is a battle that's raging that few could ever imagine. In a sense, chapter 1 and 2 tell us what's happening under the chessboard. But at the top, all the people that are dialoguing about what happened with Job are basically trying to just move their pieces and share their perspective on things. And they don't really see the whole picture, just like us today. So I sum up chapters 1 and 2. Job, unaware of satanic intervention, innocently suffers the loss of possessions, children, and health as a setting for a long dialogue on God's sovereignty over righteous suffering. Chapter 1, we have his first trials, as Jensen says in his Job, a self-study guide. And then we have further trials in chapter 2. The bankruptcy and bereavement is actually followed by physical pain, where God does allow Satan to afflict Job's body with boils from head to foot in chapter 2. So the touch his is allowed in chapter 1, but then the touch him is allowed in chapter 2, where the possessions of Job actually afflict the person of Job. And it ends in chapter 2 with Job's wife, who also was, of course, going through her own grief. We don't see too much about her in the book, but we have to remember that these 10 children were also her children, and she also was in grief. And Job just took a piece of pottery and started scraping himself, as chapter 2, verse 8 says. And he sat among the ashes, and his wife said to him, "Are you still holding to your integrity? Curse God and die." And he replied, "Oh, you're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. The same concept that we find at the end of chapter 1. So, where does it go from there? Well, to answer this question, what is the proper response to righteous suffering? This is something Job had to learn. He's not necessarily the best example of it, but he does learn in the story. And as we've seen in the first couple chapters, it's very clear that suffering sometimes comes when we haven't done anything wrong. The book's quite clear that Job was a godly man. But as we get to the middle of the book, we see the debate. And here's the debate. We struggle with righteous suffering until God tells us to rest in His incomprehensibility. I think that word incomprehensibility is the key word for this book, even though the word does not appear in the book. We struggle with this. We struggle with righteous suffering because it seems to us that if we're honoring the Lord, then things should go well with us. In fact, we have seen that that is the promise that God gives to Israel in Deuteronomy 28. That was a promise to the nation. But I think the book of Job kind of is a bit broader than what we have God promising the nation of Israel. We may not be able to relate, and I don't think we should take Deuteronomy 28 and apply it to the church. But Job, this concept applies to the church and Israel. It applies actually to all people, that we all need to rest in God's incomprehensibility. I like what my friend and former colleague Huang Sabin says about the book of Job. He highlights 5 responses to suffering. He talks about each person and their response and solution and modern equivalent and answer. And here's the first one that we've just seen, Job's wife. Her response is just to curse God and die. Now, how was he going to just die except to take his own life and just give up? And sadly, we see this response from many young people. We know that young people take their lives more than older folks. This is, of course, an unacceptable response to take our own life because we're in a situation where we cannot explain what actually is happening. So fortunately, Job doesn't do that. That's not to say that he doesn't wrestle with it. And his first speech, you might say, in chapter 3 is the beginning of him declaring his innocence in his pain. And I sum up chapters 3 to 41 this way. Job and 4 friends unsuccessfully dialogue regarding the reason for his suffering. But God declares that this question should not be asked because of His incomprehensibility and sovereignty. And what we see is an interchange of 3 cycles of debate. Eliphaz begins it. Job responds to him. Bildad then gives his speech. Job responds. Zophar speaks, and Job gives a response to Zophar. And that cycle appears the same way in chapters 15 to 21, and then it appears a third time, except Zophar doesn't make any declarations in the third cycle. And it's rather amazing to see really what these people say. In fact, it's actually quite common what they say because we hear some of the same arguments today. For example, the argument of Eliphaz. Eliphaz says, in essence, only the wicked suffer. You see the implication here? He's insinuating that Job is wicked, although he doesn't come out directly to say it. In fact, all 3 of his friends, Job's friends, really essentially say suffering is a result of sin. Take, for example, chapter 4, verse 7. Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I've observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. So, of course, their solution is, Job, you've sinned. You really need to repent here. We see this same kind of teaching in our modern day by those who are the name it, claim it people, who just say, you basically are the one who is in control of your life. If you just name it, you got it. You claim it. It's like you are sovereign over your lives. Well, that's not always applicable, is it? God does want us to be men and women of faith, but it's not as simple as just saying suffering results from sin all the time, so we just need to name it and claim it. As we go on through the drama, we see these three, and then it ends up becoming four men that end up disputing with Job. And it was a public disputation. They were all sitting around, hearing one another and giving deference to one another as each were able to share. Somebody must have took some careful notes, don't you think, for us to get a book like this. And basically what they all share in common, as we see in chapter 6, is they're all pointing the fingers at Job. They're all pointing their hands at him. They're all saying, you may think you haven't sinned, but you got to look at your life more carefully, because I think you're fooling yourself. And that was the prevailing theology of retribution. We actually find this in Proverbs 14:11. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the godly will flourish. Now, I don't want to be disrespectful to the Proverbs, but those who fear the Lord are secure. He will be a refuge for their children. I would say, really? Always? Are Proverbs meant to give promises from God that always come true in every situation? We'll address Proverbs in a future session, but this was taken in an absolute sense in Job's time. They believed that if you lived a righteous life, then you were assured that you were not going to have any difficulty, any major difficulty in your life. And Eliphaz only supported that whole idea. Only the wicked will suffer. Bildad basically says the same thing. He says that God doesn't punish the righteous. And as we go on through, we see in this cycle of debate, we also end up Job responding to that whole idea, declaring his innocence. And as Roy Zook has in the Bible Knowledge Commentary, there are a lot of repeated themes in Job's responses. Basically, despair with God and disappointment in his friends and all of these things. It's quite a fascinating study, but a lot more detailed than we can cover right now. Zophar finally has the last word in this first cycle, and he's a lot more direct. He basically says, Job, you are lying to us. You're saying you haven't sinned, but you truly have sinned. And now he doesn't have any evidence for that, but his theology tells him that Job must be sinning. When we get to chapter 12, we begin Job's response to Zophar. And Job continues arguing for his innocence. He says things like, he makes nations great and he destroys them. He enlarges nations and leads them away. Job's right about this. Job's right about God being the one who blesses and God being the one who destroys. He's getting closer to the picture here that this really all depends upon the Lord, but he can't put the pieces together. In chapter 13, we see Job continuing to lament. And in chapter 14, we see, really we could sum up basically all three of these men. It's a theology of retribution. You only get what you deserve. That was their basic premise. Job, you deserve this. We can't explain it, but you deserve it. Job doesn't agree. Job says, no, I don't deserve what I got. Why am I in this situation? I don't understand it. It's quite a lot of pressure on us when we feel like we have to give an answer for things like this. And this is the kind of pressure that Job was feeling, especially with these men. Chapter 15 begins the second cycle. Eliphaz again, only the wicked suffer. And Job responds to that. And I believe really what Job is beginning to understand here is that God is sovereign. He certainly doesn't understand God. God is incomprehensible to him. But that concept of God's incomprehensibility explains righteous suffering, which I think is the theme for the book of Job. He's beginning to come into focus perhaps a bit here. But Job still doesn't have it quite all together yet. Bildad continues, the wicked will be judged. And in chapter 19, we actually see Job giving the third of the 5 responses to suffering. Job essentially says, God's not fair, and he doesn't care. I find it very comforting to know that God was patient with Job when he was really struggling here. He says in chapter 19, verse 7, though I cry, I've been wronged, I get no response. Though I call for help, there's no justice. Basically, Job is complaining to God. And isn't this like most mourners today? Most people who complain to the Lord and they say, God is not really fair with me. Frankly, I think most of us feel that way with God. We think that God ought to make our lives a lot easier than he actually does. And he doesn't really care for us. Of course, that is an unbiblical perspective on God. Who loves you more than God? When we understand that, we can actually handle these difficulties in life much better. In chapter 20, Zophar once again becomes very direct. Job, you are a hypocrite. You're saying one thing and doing another. You're saying you're righteous, but you're not even acting righteous before God right now. Maybe Zophar didn't realize how much complaining God can put up with. And so what we see in these cycles of debate, as we finish the second cycle, is these men are implying things in the first cycle. It's implication, general recommendations. But once we get to this middle cycle, it is more insinuation. It's a bit more direct. It's specific advice. Hey, you better repent from your sin. Whereas in the first cycle, it was more like, maybe you've done something wrong. And the second cycle takes less chapters, 7 chapters instead of 12. But as we move our way into the third cycle, we'll see that it actually moves into indictment. I think these friends of Job are getting quite impatient. Here we find vicious accusations. This is very difficult to handle. When people don't understand and when we don't understand why we are going through the difficulties that we go through. Sometimes this even happens when people are in grief, and people actually attack those people that are in grief by saying, oh, the reason you have the difficulties you have is because of sin in your life and you need to repent and that sort of thing. So Zophar doesn't make any appearance here in chapter 3, but Eliphaz and Bildad do. Eliphaz says, repent. Repent of your sin. And Bildad has his word after Job says in chapter 24, his piece, and then Bildad pretty much finishes it. So really what we've got going on here is we have Job saying something, Eliphaz responding, Bildad responding, Zophar responding. Job is really the focal point of all of this. And it happens over and over and over until Job gives a long response here. And finally, when we get to this third cycle, Bildad says, how can anyone be right with God? Of course, he's thinking in a very absolute sense. Job, you're not perfect. And frankly, Job never actually claimed to be perfect. He just claimed to be not one who had sinned and there was a particular sin that was causing his suffering. And as we get to the end, it's still this question of why do the innocent suffer is actually not being answered so far. Satan says, you deserve suffering. The three friends say, well, this is retribution. God's getting you because you truly deserve it. And as we move into Elihu's comments, Elihu says that this is discipline. This is God disciplining his people. And finally, God will have the last word here, and I believe God says, I'm not obligated to tell you. Incomprehensibility is my trademark. God is God. And if we could demand of God whatever we wanted and God had to acquiesce to our desires, then we would be God. We'd be God and God would be our divine servant, if you will. God's not going to let that happen. And as we move on into these latter chapters, we see that Elihu gives 4 speeches. First to all 4 of them, then to 3 of them, then to Job. And he appears to be quite arrogant because he's the youngest of them. And he seems to be caught up in his eloquence. But he really doesn't really share a whole lot more insight than the others do. He quotes Job saying, I'm pure and without sin and clean. He was listening very carefully to Job. And yet, what does he actually come up with? He says, Job, you say God does not speak. Elihu says, he does speak. Chapter 33, he says, God speaks through dreams. God speaks through pain. You shouldn't be the one to tell God how he's supposed to speak. And Elihu has a bit of a twist on what the others say. Instead of saying that suffering comes as a result of sin, Elihu says trials are for teaching. He sounds a bit like James chapter 1 here, where James said, consider it joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you might be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Elihu has that kind of a theology. The trials are for our benefit. They're for our good. He says they're for our teaching. He says in chapter 33:14, for God speaks in one way, and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with continual strife in his bones. You get rebuked. You learn things. So the solution really is to endure under God. And if this sounds familiar, it's familiar because this is the message that most preachers deliver from the pulpit. And there's some truth to it, that trials do teach us. James certainly says that, James 1, verses 2 to 4. But is that what the book of Job is saying? Finally, when we get to God, chapters 38 and following, God says that we should not ask the question of why. Why are trials happening to me? But we should ask the question of who. Who is actually in control? The solution is to worship. The solution is to submit ourselves to a holy God. And honestly, in terms of our popular theology, there is no modern equivalent for this because this is an unpopular answer. People don't want to hear this. People want simple answers. People want, especially in our very complicated world, people want us to just follow a formula, and it's just so simple, and you've got it right there. It's not quite all that helpful from a modern perspective. But this is God's word. This is what God says. And the Life Application Bible has a very good depiction of how these people have helped. I like this. The way that these men helped Job was that they sat in silence for 7 days. That was what really helped. They were doing great until they opened their mouths. And sometimes I think that happens for us as well. Sometimes people just need us to come and sit with them, especially when they're in grief, when someone has passed away. Who could actually have words adequate to help them in their grief? And yet God helped because he told Job to be content without knowing why he suffered. This is very helpful. Our contentment doesn't come from knowing the reason of our suffering. Our contentment comes from knowing God. And Elihu continues on in his speeches. In his second speech, he affirms that God is just. Actually, that's not news to any of them. I think all the others agreed with that. He also said in his third speech that God is sovereign. I don't think Job had a problem with that. Neither did Elihu, Bildad, or Zophar. And so anyway, they all had these different perspectives of God. I like what Bruce Wilkinson and Kenneth Boa present in their book, Talk Through the Bible. This is very helpful because it shows the differences between these four men. Eliphaz is a theologian who relies on his observation and his experience. You see, as you go through, he's constantly referring to his experience and his observations. Bildad, on the other hand, is more of a historian. He's a legalist. He goes with tradition. His voice is one of history. Just look back in history. Zophar is more of a moralist and a dogmatist. That's why he's so rude and blunt. He has all these assumptions, especially that Job has sinned. And Elihu is a young theologian and an intellectual who relies on his education because he probably was the most learned of all of them, even though he was the youngest. And his personality is one of more perceptiveness and even some conceit, being the youngest and waxing eloquent. Well, when we get to chapter 37, we actually find, finally, it's Elihu who gives us the key verse of the book. Elihu says it quite well here. The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in power. In his justice and great righteousness, he does not oppress. Therefore, men revere him. For does he not have regard for all the wise in heart? Look at what he says here. He acknowledges that the Almighty is incomprehensible, that God is far beyond what any of us could ever conceive. So if we make it our goal to try to understand everything as much as God does, we are going to be frustrated. I think we're going to have to submit to him. And we will be wise in heart when we revere him, as he says here in verse 24. There's a good word for us, especially when we're undergoing some difficult times. Well, that ends the words of men up to chapter 37. As God would have it, he does not want the book to end there, though. God has what I'll call the midterm exam. I used to call this the final exam, but then I realized, well, Job actually lived 140 years after this, so it must have been a midterm. And it has two parts. One of it is short answer. God says to Job, can you answer even one of my questions? And this is like many of our midterms that we take that have short answer questions, maybe multiple choice. And part two is the essay questions, in chapters 40, verse 6 to the end of 41. God says, which of my attributes do you have, Job? Which one? Of course, he answers none of them. And are you stronger than Behemoth and Leviathan? Two humongous creatures that God had made that Job was familiar with. So God says in his solution to suffering, chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." And this actually begins a series of questions from God. A series of questions that Job could not answer. You know, if you make up midterm exams, you can make them up in such a way that nobody could ever get even one answer correct. I did that once for my students. I gave them an exam. Question number 1 was something like, give the 34th word on page 267. I remember looking at my students as they were taking the exam. What? The second question was, how many words were in today's reading? What? I mean, you could design an exam like that that nobody could ever get any of the answers right. Well, I did that for my students, and everybody got a 0. And then after they turned them all in, I said, "How do you feel about the exam?" And they felt miserable. And I said to them, "I want you to understand a little bit of the grace of God. Today on the exam, everybody gets 100%, no matter what your grade was. Okay?" And you should have heard the sigh of relief in that classroom. And I wanted to teach them an important lesson. That it was not in their doing, it was not in their answers, it was God's grace that sustained them in their lives. I think that's what God wanted to do with Job here. And God actually in chapter 39 refers to some mythological creatures. I won't get into the details of all of that, but he focuses in on these creatures, I think, in maybe a poetic way. But when we get into the essay questions, we have some rather amazing statements here, where God says, for example, "Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you, which feeds on the grass like an ox. What strength he has in his loins, what power in the muscles of his belly. His tail sways like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are close knit. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like rods of iron." Well, there have been many explanations of what Behemoth was. I go through all the various explanations, about 6 or 7 of them, in my notes, but I'm going to just jump all the way to the end, except for hippopotamus. Is this really hippopotamus? He says here that his tail sways like the cedar. And the cedar was the largest tree in the Middle East. Is this really an elephant, as some say? Tail of an elephant is not like a cedar. The tail of a hippo is not exactly like a cedar. So, what then is Behemoth? This child reads this passage and he's thinking, tail like a cedar, that must be a huge, like a dinosaur, like an animal. But the footnote in my Bible says Behemoth is possibly an elephant or a hippopotamus. That's a strange looking elephant or hippo, don't you think? If his tail sways like a cedar, this must have been a very, very large animal. Not a hippo, not an elephant, but more like one that we have actually discovered in recent years. Perhaps a plant-eating dinosaur. Campbell and Whitcomb specify Apatosaurus. Others say other types of dinosaurs. And the massive strength of dinosaurs befits Behemoth really more than any other animal. It's an interesting depiction because when we get to Job 41, we find a similar description, except this one's called Leviathan. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook or tie down his tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Friends, we have done this with basically every animal, have we not? Even in the time of Job. Will he keep begging you for mercy? And the description of this goes on, and I won't take the time to spell it all out for you, except to say, I believe actually what we've got here is not a crocodile, as some have said, but actually an animal that was a lot more terrifying than a crocodile. Probably more of a marine, meat-eating dinosaur. Maybe a T-Rex, maybe Allosaurus or Ankylosaurus, because he says here that you cannot harpoon him. Well, people have been harpooning crocodiles for generations. And in any case, I don't want to get too focused on those. I really want us to, most of all, understand the main point in Job's writing here. And that is the question that all of us address, and that is, what is the proper response to righteous suffering? We have seen that the setting is true, that there are clearly times when people suffer righteously. Job is just an example of many others. And yet people debate about this. People realize that this doesn't make sense to our human understanding until God tells us to rest in his incomprehensibility. So finally, our resolution in chapter 42, in the third movement of the book, is simply this. Our proper response is to submit to God. Maybe you notice the title of this session is Be Submissive. I think that sums up what God is telling Job. Our proper response to righteous suffering is to submit to God. When we get into chapter 42, we see that Job submits to God for his incomprehensibility and sovereignty, and then he prays for his friends and has restored possessions, children, and health, thus affirming God's blessing on those who accept his plan. And so we see, if you count the number of animals Job has in chapter 1 compared to chapter 42, they all double, except for the number of sons and daughters. They remain the same. And it says that Job actually lived another 140 years after his restoration. What an encouraging account. So the last verse of the book says, after this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the fourth generation. And so he died, old and full of years. It was a difficult experience for him that probably took several months. The count doesn't really say, but it does help us to see that the proper response to righteous suffering is, let me see if I can sum it up in one sentence. Be submissive. Be submissive to God's incomprehensibility, rather than trying to figure suffering out. There are times when we should wrestle through things and try to find the answer. But there are times when we are just not going to reach the answer. We're not going to find it. God has not given it to us. He's actually told us, rest in me. Be submissive to God's incomprehensibility, rather than trying to figure suffering out. There's a time when we rest, when we give up, when we recognize, as we have in the key word for Job, that God is incomprehensible and he chooses to be that way with us. Even if we don't want it that way, he makes it that way for us. So I sum up the book of Job. Job's suffering, dialogue with others and God, and restoration reveal that the proper response to righteous suffering is submission to God, rather than questioning his incomprehensibility and sovereignty. So how do we apply this book to our lives? Well, during righteous suffering, Do not question the reason for your plight. Don't ask the question, why? You will just be frustrated because God is under no obligation to answer your why question. Instead, submit to God by trusting in God's wisdom rather than your answers or even the answers of those well-meaning counselors who seek to help you. Trust in Him. Be submissive to Him during life's perplexities.